Okay, thank you. So yes, I will be talking about Carmen Sandiego and preserving virtual worlds a little bit, and I will start with a little bit about preserving virtual worlds 2, which we are wrapping today, I think, completely. Yes. This is a project that, as was said, is IMLS funded, and we worked in conjunction with Stanford, Rochester Institute of Technology, and the University of Maryland. Was sort of a continuation of Preserving Virtual Worlds 1 that was looking at the significant properties of video games. And so the sort of major impetus behind the driving force, the driving question behind this particular project was to look at what is significant about a game. And then once we know what's significant about it, we can sort of figure out what needs to be preserved long-term for sort of longevity. So this is our driving question. And we had a number of deliverables that come out of this. And one of the sort of major ones that I had the privilege of working on was a questionnaire that we hope to turn loose on the general public that allows people to tell us what they find significant about particular games with a sort of focus on game franchises like Carmen Sandiego that persist over time. And so a lot of this questionnaire sort of tries to elicit what it is that makes a game important and thus worth preserving according to the various user communities that might engage with game software. So both the academics and the people who want to preserve it like we do and the archivists, but also the players of the game, right? The people who remember Carmen Sandiego and Oregon Trail and all of these other fun games. And so we have to sort of figure out what is significant first so we can figure out what to preserve second. And so this kind of research into Carmen Sandiego and my general experience with PVW over the last sort of 6 semesters led to a number of different research avenues and venues, and I thought that I would sort of discuss just a handful of them today. And so one of them is this kind of what I decided is the unfair burden that we place on the preservation of newer technologies. And so talking a little bit about when we are preserving video games like Carmen Sandiego, what preservation strategies are good, what are good enough, and what do we sort of expect in terms of levels of perfection of preservation. And this is something that comes out in particular in our research, and for me most pertinently when we were sitting down with all of our collaborators at the end of this project, and people were talking about the problems that they foresaw going forward in the conservation of games. And so we have a number of, different strategies that we think about when we want to preserve games. And some of our biggest ones are emulation or recreation. And these are really controversial, right? Because are we actually doing preservation if we are recreating something from scratch? And what is that what are the implications of that? And then I think one of the big methods that we have right now are for playing games, emulation, right? So if you want to go home and play Oregon Trail, which some of you might, your chances are you have a free emulator that you downloaded from the web of the sort of early DOS version of Oregon Trail. And so these are some really sort of common methods that we have. And I have an example up there. And for those of you who can see it and know what it is, this is a screenshot from Super Mario World. But this is a screenshot that's taken from the Nintendo Wii version. So this is not emulated, it's not migrated, it is in fact reprogrammed from scratch to look just like the game that you might remember playing from the 90s. And so we actually see a big push, at least in the commercial realm right now, to recreate games for sort of nostalgic sales purposes. And so this is something that I think comes up a lot when we talk about media art, that recreation of content is something that I find more prevalently in this kind of research than I do in the preservation of other types of content. And so this kind of brings us to the question of, do we preserve the old code, or does it matter if we write new code as long as it looks the same? And this is a really important question that we asked a lot of our interview subjects while we were working on PVW2. Would you mind if we took your game, completely reprogrammed the back end so that the code looked nothing like what you designed in 1985, but when you play it, it looks exactly the same, glitch for glitch, screen for screen. You get the kind of grindy noise that would have been there while your DOS computer loaded the other side of the disk. And as long as that's there, does that sort of encapsulate conservation for you? And a lot of our game designers, without even us having to lead them that far down that path, said that's more important than saving the back end code. And then there are the people I think actually found more from our team of researchers than from the video game people that we talked to who said, well, that's not preservation. We need that code. That code is sort of essential. So these are sort of the questions here. And so this brings me to my own sort of idea of what are our expectations of the preservation of newer technologies, and how realistic are they? Because when we look at our sort of historical means of preservation of much older technologies, you can see that we accept all sorts of substitutions for older technologies that don't look and behave anything like the original. And so I'm thinking one of the examples that we come across a lot is the Canterbury Tales, which almost all of you probably had to read in English 101. And when you read that book as a Penguin Classic, you did not read it in Old English. You might have had that copy that had Old English on one page and regular English on the other, and I'm willing to bet that you completely ignored one side and looked a lot at the other. Is that not Chaucer's Canterbury Tales? Is it a different book because we're reading it in a different kind of English? The example that comes up a lot in the literature when you're looking at literature around time-based media art, which is my own sort of area and background of specialty before I started working with video games, is this music analogy. This is a toccata and fugue in D minor, but it's arranged for piano. But is it still J.S. Bach's toccata and fugue in D minor? I'm assuming most of you would say yes, but that's not how he wrote it. It didn't look like that, and it certainly wasn't for that instrument because that instrument didn't exist. And I think this is a really great one. Microfilm. That's not a newspaper. Newspapers don't look like that. They don't feel like that. They don't behave like that, but our accepted methodologies for preserving newspaper is on microfilm, and we think that's okay. So why is it that in order to get a copy of Mario, it has to look that much like the original, when a lot of other things that we're preserving don't bear any kind of that amount of resemblance? And I think that this has a lot to do with the newness of this technology and the fact that video games are 30 years old compared to the age of some of these other examples. Carmen Sandiego, personal favorite of mine. And I looked at this as part of our game set for PBW to try to figure out what is significant about Carmen. And there are many avenues of significance that came up. And obviously there's technical significance, like from the Inspect framework, where I can say, well, this was the color space of the 1985 game. These are the limitations that were programmed into it based on the size of the processors at the time of the platforms that we're using. There's also significance that we derived from interviews with people who worked on this game. This was an interesting set of people. We had game developers and also some marketers from the company that made Carmen Sandiego who had really different ideas about what made Carmen significant. So for one of the designers, what is significant is you collect and find stuff. That's all that's significant about Carmen. It is a scavenger hunt game, right? That is primarily what is significant. And then you have the person who was in charge of marketing, who says this has to sell to a school audience because in 1985 no one has a personal computer. The only way that kids have access is in a school, which is why we have to have things like a book for every Carmen game. And then also the players, the fans, and even the academics. Marcia Kinder, who writes ad nauseum about Carmen Sandiego and her effect on programming. The Chief and the acapella PBS, we all remember. My personal favorite, Waldo and Carmen porn fanfic on the web. There's lots of that. So how significant are these aspects? How significant is the time? Both the fact that when I play the 1985 game, I have to know 1985 geography. The place, meaning both the fact that the sort of rampant U.S. centrism of this game and of the television shows, but also, the school setting of the original media. How important are issues of gender? Both of Carmen. Carmen is a female character. She looks male in the original game because they didn't have enough space on the disc to program a female avatar. The good guys and the bad guys, and I think importantly, of course, the chiefs, who are generally white men with the exception of Lynn Thigpen on PBS. How important are issues of race, right? Carmen Sandiego in Junior Detective and Carmen Sandiego Deluxe are the first sort of full color editions where you start to see people of different races and genders sort of really coming to the fore. And how do we code bad guys and good guys of different racial sort of proclivities. So this research is headed towards a lot of sort of different directions. And so I thought I would talk about one of them today in the last like 30 seconds here, and that is documentation. If I am creating an archival package for Carmen Sandiego, I need to document aspects of the game beyond just the color space, beyond the bit stream. If I decide that something like the race and gender implications in Carmen are important, these are not necessarily entirely embodied in the code in the software itself. So what kind of documentation do I need to include to understand the cultural artifact that was Carmen Sandiego? And this is really, really complicated, in part because our current ideas of data don't even allow for us to document these things. OAS doesn't consider my thoughts on the race and gender of Carmen to be data. And I have just some examples here, which I won't read because I'm out of time, of what constitutes data. And my ideas on the significance of race and gender in Carmen don't fit anywhere in here. So one of the sort of future directions of this research is rethinking typologies of data and information types within repositories like OAS to include information that is beyond just the bit stream itself. And I'm out of time. So,